Come here, Maddie.
Hi, everybody. I'm Todd Fink, and I am talking with my friend Lauren Korshak today. Lauren is a marriage and family therapist. She's also a dating coach, a mindfulness teacher, and she recently authored a book called The Mindful Relationship, which I read and really enjoyed last fall. And that's why I wanted to talk to her today and have a little dialogue to talk about social distancing and how some of the pandemic is affecting people, and also how it pertains to people who are single and may still be hoping to find love in all of this chaos. So, how are you, Lauren?
I am doing well.
You're quarantined in California, right?
Quarantined in Southern California. I am from the Bay Area, or I live in the Bay Area, but I'm down in Los Angeles with my family.
Okay. So, what are you noticing that's interesting to you as a therapist with respect to social distancing, and also the different ways that people interpret how we're supposed to be observing this measure? Has it been stressful at all for you personally?
Yeah, a lot of questions in there and a
Yeah,
lot of
sorry about that.
conversation. I think, yes, it's been stressful to me personally. We can talk about that. And also, I think two of the things that it brings up for me are boundaries and how we manage uncomfortable feelings, right? So the boundaries being, how do we um, communicate what space feels comfortable to us? I think a lot of times we might feel uncomfortable um, if we it might be hard to manage right now. Like if you feel comfortable with 6 feet of distance, but you try to go. This has happened to me personally. And go try to go for a walk with a friend, and want to keep that boundary, and they keep walking closer, or other people keep walking closer. There's a lot to manage, and so, like, how do you communicate that and maintain that, and or just recognize, maybe those kinds of walks aren't the right kind of walk to be taking right now if it really is important to you to like follow certain guidelines. So, but boundaries, I mean, that's one example, but I think it also comes up with, like, as a therapist, seeing people in person versus remotely, and what that brings up for people. I think the other thing that plays into that is choice, like people wanting to feel like they can have a choice. And I think a lot of sort of defiant feelings of being controlled came up when the social distancing orders were put in place, at least in California. Um, and then I think the other thing is, like, when, we're feeling a lot of fear or grief or anxiety, all the different feelings that are coming up with this, some people might turn to coping mechanisms like denial. You and I talked about this a little bit, like not reading the news, things like that. And then that
We're
is
kind of
gonna,
getting mixed messages on the news, like
yeah,
don't limit your news intake, but the measures and the instructions and the guidelines are changing almost hourly, it seems like, if not daily. Now we're being advised to wear masks outside of the house. And
yeah. So
so,
it's
what is the healthy balance there?
with wearing a mask or with
No,
reading.
with the news intake.
Well, you and I were talking a little bit about this. I think, like, I think that's an important exploration, because I think there's this idea that we shouldn't, like, we're not wanting to expose ourselves to things that generate excessive fear and anxiety, but at the same time, I think, again, it's like not being in denial, reading enough news so that we are abreast of what the CDC is saying. And so, I mean, maybe it's like you and I were saying, like, not reading the Sun, but or like reading, tabloids right now, or but following, reading, credible sources, hospital guidelines.
Mhm.
So I think I do read the New York Times. I think they have a lot of good human interest stories. Um, I think there's other sources too, but reading trusted news sources, and reading articles that like The Hammer and the Dance is a good one, that just give you a lot of information about how this, like, strategies for coping with this, how it's been dealt with in other countries, how at risk we are, and how to deal with it effectively. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's any good precedent for this. And
Hmm.
there's not consensus anywhere in our country. Like you had mentioned to me before, some Californians have felt like, well, it may not really come here or hasn't really come here. But that's how everyone has reacted everywhere on the planet when it was only somewhere else. Even when we first started hearing about cases in the United States, in Seattle, I think most of the country was still like, well, it's just in Seattle. And then
Yeah,
that's
and that's
because of exponential growth. We don't really intuitively grasp that in our brains.
yes, and I mean I think that's why it's really important to be reading the news, because if you have read credible news sources, we recognize that that these arguments about it's not coming here don't actually hold any water. So it's like these um, we wherever it is, oh in China, they don't, there it's overpopulated, they don't have health care, right? It's in Italy, oh well they kiss each other on the cheeks. It's in Washington, oh it's only there in and so right now in California, I think a lot of people are getting it, but it's like there's these divides, right, of people with different levels of awareness and different levels of anxiety. And so how do we support, I mean that's where mental health I think is really important. How do we support people and managing the anxiety, and also increasing awareness and consciousness, and that
Yeah.
definitely goes into the other theme of affecting our relationships, because if you're dealing, two people are at different levels of awareness and different levels of anxiety, and they're living together in a small space, then there's a lot to navigate. And
Yeah, and I think self-awareness impacts this as well because, like, I had heard that one of the health officials, while giving out instructions for social distancing, she's also mentioning, don't touch your face. Meanwhile, she's licking her finger and turning the pages.
yes, yeah.
So,
Yeah, that's such a great example, and I see so much of that, and I see that sometimes from people who are really fearful and generating a lot of fear, like people that I've known, and then are doing the things that they're telling other people not to do, right?
right.
So,
Self-awareness is big though, because I do think when people are in one state of mind, they think, I need to make sure I'm 6 feet apart from everybody. But then
mhm.
if they're in a different state of mind, they forget. They don't know.
Totally. And this is what I noticed out on the 6 foot walks that I'm no longer taking. Um, is that it's hard to focus on more than one thing at a time. And I think that's what's going on with coronavirus is there's not one, we don't know where it's coming. It could, the CDC doesn't know. It's a shifting target. So it's like
Hmm.
people are focused on, right, in the moment, maybe hand washing, and then you forget about touching your face or a mask. You forget all of the different things. And so some of these are habits, but then like on these walks, right, you're like, okay, I'm trying to keep 6 feet from this person, but then somebody else walks right in front of you. So so it's really hard to manage it. And so that's why I think, the strategy that the government has chosen, the shelter in place, it's really wise, because it's based on, what's worked in other places. And they're giving us the opportunity to do that without putting us on a complete lockdown, which I think is really nice. And hopefully we won't need to go into complete lockdown. But I mean, if we're not, continuing to build this self-awareness and clarity and being careful and recognizing it definitely can happen, and hit that same curve that's hitting in New York and everywhere else where we are, then yeah, in trouble.
Well, I think then sheltering in place is obviously going to be different for everybody. And that sacrifice is
Hmm.
not the same for every person, every family. Obviously, it's different if you're single and alone compared to
Hmm.
sheltering in place with your family or your partner. So I mean, has anything come up in your work that with people who are struggling with loneliness or struggling with being around their partner 24 hours a day? Because that's new. Either way, it's new, right? It's one thing to see your partner like for a couple hours in the evening, and now to be around them every day with your kids, maybe too. It's a big challenge.
Yeah, no, you bring up a really, really relevant point. Yeah, I've seen everything, right? Like I've seen it's hard to be single during this time, right? It's been really hard for people who are in beginning new relationships to navigate that, and different, like this goes back to the boundaries thing. Different people have different boundaries.
Hmm.
So This is for like the new relationships. One person might be a lot more careful than the other, and that might prevent the more careful one from wanting to see the other one. And this is new relationships, and also this is established relationships. So that's one way, like those different boundaries and how those put extra strain on the relationship. Also, yeah, I mean, I think people are trying not to break up and to just maintain if they are in relationships and dating. But there are some extra pressures put on the relationships. And yeah, like one person I was speaking with yesterday was saying that they and their partner split, like not necessarily a breakup, but one moved out and went back to their apartment. They had been together the whole time, and they just need that space to kind of see what's going to happen, and are trying not to break up because it's just a time where we really need relationships and we can't be completely socially isolated. I mean, some people are enjoying that, I would say, but
Depends on your personality, right? I
yeah,
keep
and
telling people who are a little bit more alone to try to treat it as a temporary meditation retreat that you've volunteered for, because there's a big difference when being alone is involuntary compared to voluntary.
right,
It's a punishment when it's involuntary, like imprisonment or solitary confinement. But when people choose it, they can have extraordinary psychological breakthroughs. We've
yeah,
learned of that throughout history, that there are psychological truths that come out of people with intense periods of seclusion and meditation and so on. But you have to have the right state of mind for that.
yeah. And I think that's actually the state of mind we all really need right now. Like
I
this
think
is
so.
a spiritual crisis.
Hmm.
The mental health issues, the emotional issues brought up by this, they all are things that we need to reflect on, and to get through to the other side of this as a culture and as a community, because this is just bringing to the surface, I think, a lot of issues that um, were already there just under the surface, right?
Sure.
There, social isolation and loneliness have been a growing problem since far before this, and so it's really, but we
I
can
agree.
we can when we have that free choice, when we can go out, when we can go to the grocery store, when we can find ways to distract ourselves, um, we can maybe minimize the impact of that. But right now there's nowhere to go except
Yeah.
inward.
I've been saying that I hope this is actually the beginning of the end of social distancing, in the
Yeah,
sense that friends might come together for dinner, but they're not actually with each other. Each one is looking in their hand in their phone.
right.
I have noticed, I don't know if this will continue, but if I make a supply run and I see other people, that there's a connection, that the interaction isn't just transactional anymore. It's like everybody now knows the truth that was always there, that there's real adversity behind every person's face. And
Hmm.
and that connects us. I've also noticed among some of the patients, I've talked about this before with some other friends, and I'm curious to know if it's been your experience, that people who've already been struggling with depression or social anxiety aren't actually much more triggered by this, because this is the tension that has already been there for them. I mean, if anything, it's like when you bring a person to group therapy for the first time and suddenly they realize, oh, actually being around other people who struggle with similar things can be helpful. So I say that it's a reckoning of empathy too.
Yeah.
Ordinarily, these painful things and catastrophe strikes a particular family or individual or community, and people look over, they may donate or they may come to a funeral when someone loses a loved one, but then that person or family or community is really left to pick up the pieces maybe for the rest of their life. And everyone else, I think, unconsciously just has to rationalize it and move on. But in this case, nobody's really moving on. We all know that the world is paused. And so maybe it is worth doing what you're saying, and turn towards those inner experiences and that were always there, and process that, and take this time to treat it like we're on a worldwide meditation retreat and able to face ourselves maybe for the first time.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the only way out, really. And I like what you're saying too, because yeah, it's very validating for people who maybe already struggled or already had, tendencies to try to be really clean, or these different things. A lot of
Yeah.
people feeling really validated, like, see, the threat is real, these things are real. And they are. And the social isolation, the pain that we're feeling is real, and without distractions. I mean, it's normal to feel some sadness. And we're kind of in a culture where that we're told we shouldn't, and we should just avoid it and pretend we don't feel it and distract ourselves and turn on Netflix, turn on the TV. um, but right now there's only, I mean, you can try that, but I think you'll get sick of it after a few months, and then it's like those feelings are still going to be there. And the choice is really, do we want to find a way to work with these, accept them, acknowledge them, move through them.
Hmm.
There's a really great article that I've been referring to a lot with clients and in some of my classes, called "That Discomfort You're Feeling Is Grief." uh,
Uh-huh.
David, I think it's an interview with David Kessler, who wrote a book called "The Sixth Stage of Grief: Finding Meaning." But it talks a lot about just what we can do to work with the discomfort we're feeling, which is like accept the feelings, practice being present, practice compassion. Um, so yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that, but
No, I think grief is probably what is hitting people, at least at times. I've noticed in myself, I'll feel totally fine, and then like a wave of heaviness will come over.
hmm
And I think it's because I don't have my normal routine. It may also be the grief of the collective loss that we know is all around us, people dying, people losing loved ones, people losing their livelihoods. 6 million people or so filed for unemployment so far.
yeah.
And that's a whole nother dimension of risk on this whole scope of health risk. There's the risk of mental illness, the risk of suicide. I was looking at statistics with depression and anxiety for suicide. And for men who have ever been diagnosed with depression, the suicide rate is 7%. Fortunately, it's much lower for women. But it's interesting that if you accept depression as a disease, because it fits disease models, then the suicide rate would really be the mortality rate, like we talk about with the coronavirus, for instance.
hmm
And yeah, and if that is twice as high or more than the virus, it needs to be factored in all of this too, in the whole paradigm of health risk. So I think there's many opportunities here for radical empathy. And that's how I also process maybe my anger. Anger comes up, I think, for me from time to time with how people respond to the guidelines. Obviously, there is disparity among how the virus affects people. It doesn't affect this group as much as this group. Older people are more at risk, and younger people are less at risk. Children seem, for the most part, to only be carriers, but not really struggle with it. There's some exceptions, of course. And I've gotten a lot of questions, Lauren, about how can people reframe their anger around younger people not really taking this seriously. And I didn't have anything good to say right away. I was just kind of like, well, empathy always helps me, like, try to be empathetic. Remember what it was like when you were a kid. I was talking with my brother, and we were able to honestly say we probably would have just kept partying if we were 18 when this happened, or just done our thing and tuned out a lot of it if we knew we were going to be low risk. And I think that took some honesty, but that wasn't really good enough, I don't think, for an answer for people. So I often just go to meditation when I don't have the right reframing for my anger, just sit silently. But then this idea dawned on me that the medical experts have pleaded with younger people to take this seriously, to change their ways, and they've warned that this virus is spreading, the threat is real, and it's already bad in some places. And then they said, look, okay, even though this might not harm you, don't you want to protect your parents and grandparents because you could carry it? I juxtapose this with something else that's abstract, like climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Environmental experts have been warning older people, pleading with them to change their ways, saying, look, climate change is coming. The threat is real. And in fact, it's already bad in some places like Australia, or fires in California, like you've been around. And look, it may not harm you because you've already lived a full life and you've enjoyed the lifestyle. But don't you want to protect your children and grandchildren? And I find that helpful for me to just kind of find these points of empathy and these reverse symmetries.
Yeah. I think this is all a really big topic that plays into relationships as well, and like
Mm-hmm.
navigating boundaries as well. Because that anger, right? There's first, anger is part of grief. It's one of the stages of grief. So just there's that to know too. And there's also how do we work with our anger in an emotionally mature way. And part of that, in therapy, we talk a lot about underneath anger, there's usually an unmet need, and how do we communicate that versus just reacting to it? Because when we're and I've navigated this some in my own relationships here, like when I feel, my boundaries are violated around what I think is right for how we should be interacting with my parents, for example, or different things. It doesn't help if I just lash out in anger, right? And so, like you're saying, turning to meditation, I think that's where a lot of our spiritual work. Yes, we're isolated, but we're not isolated from our reactions to relationships and to feelings, and to whether it's the collective young people on the street who are out partying, or whether it's somebody in our life, or a partner, or someone we're dating who has a different view of how they should be handling things. When we have that anger, how do we work with it and try to have a productive outcome with it? I mean, this is politics too, or the climate change, right? And
Yeah.
part of it, I think, is like really practicing compassion and taking in and working with our own anger before we just um, react, but also not abandoning what the anger is telling us. Like, okay, there's something that needs to be addressed here, and how to address it in a way that can get heard, or I can make some impact. Maybe it's not even with this person or with this group, or maybe it is. Maybe I can create a way to reach them. But also, like, how do I, diffuse my anger to some extent, not let go of it, not get rid of it, but channel it, I think.
Yeah. I think boundaries have got to be pretty hard for some people because you could always just leave. I mean, if that's like the level of boundary you need, ordinarily, it's like, well, then you got to get out of there. We might tell somebody, right? But you may not actually be able to get out of there. People might be literally like stuck in that
Yeah.
space.
Yeah, it's kind of like, so I think boundaries have taken this like interesting position in Western psychology, where it's like, I told them my boundary and then they didn't do it. And like, so I'm leaving, and but really boundaries for me are much more about being able to work with that reactivity, and not just identify like, I need you to give me space or whatever, but sometimes it is giving, I need you to give me space, but it's not just asserting that, but also figuring out kind of what the underlying feeling and need are, and how to like work with that and bring that into relationship and navigate that with people who are willing to listen. Of course, like with a toxic relationship, we do try to leave. But right now we're in a position where even in those relationships, hopefully, um, there's more of a willingness than there ever has been to work on the situations, because we are trapped in a sense. Like, there's nowhere to go. There's no safety, really. There's only what we all co-create together. And so each and every one of us is responsible for creating this safety together right now. And if we deny that, we get really badly hurt. We could hurt other people around us. And so I think, though, one thing that I'm holding, that I'm wanting to believe in, maybe it's wishful thinking, is that um, even if people are resistant at first, like trusting that they're going to start to open up more and more to acceptance over time, because as the threat gets closer, or more real. There's like a forced acceptance that's happening. So I'm hoping that that starts to happen. But yeah, I mean, ideally, we would have all just really listened to the orders and maybe even delayed all of the what's happened so far a little more.
Well, it kind of shows how important some kind of cooperation is.
Cooperation and leadership, and
Leadership.
leadership has
And,
been nationally was lacking around this. We didn't do anything that
and at every level, wouldn't you say? I mean, like, states don't agree.
well, I think within states they might not agree, but I would say like I've been touched by California's approach and their leadership around it. Like when the leaders above them weren't naming this as at the level of threat that it needed to be, they took matters into their own hands, and started the shelter in place and really led the way kind of in a grassroots way, which, so I think there's been some on a smaller scale. I know where I am now, the city of Los Angeles is doing a lot. San Francisco's done a lot. I think we were all like a little behind the curve. Um,
Well, San Francisco was one of the earlier cities, right, to put in a shelter in place,
yeah,
I
and
think
it's
before others.
better than would be expected. I mean, they've flattened the curve a little bit. The growth isn't as exponential, so that's speaks well of them. But I noticed like even when they first put the 2 weeks of social distancing, avoid all large gatherings in place, um, most of the events that I had planned, including like a book signing that I was going to do, got canceled that weekend. But some people threw parties and went out anyway. A lot of people didn't go because they were listening, but um, so yeah, San Francisco on a government level put out there, I think, exactly what they needed to put out there, but it's taken a while for people to listen, and um, yeah, but they're getting, I don't know, there are results from them doing that. Right? It's not as exponential as in
This is
other.
a real opportunity then for compassion when you think about it. Like, keeping people safe requires that some people elevate their compassion. Because if you know, like, you're, especially like, let's say you're in one of those low risk groups, or you think you've already had it, so you've
Mm,
built immunity up to it, um, but you still ought to observe these measures to protect other people in the chain. It's requiring people to think beyond themselves if we're
mhm.
going to take care of each other. But we're also learning, I think, through that, the interconnectedness, because it's like every day that passes that people don't really take it seriously is like another day we're probably going to have to do it on the back end, which hurts all of us economically and limits us in so many ways. So everybody's choice in this affects everybody else, at least in some small
Yeah,
way.
yeah. And I think that really just, again, speaks to sort of a lot of deep seated spiritual principles. I remember like this one time I did a sweat lodge, and the guidelines around the sweat lodge are you don't drink or use substances 24 hours beforehand. And they ask you when you get there, and one of the people that came to the sweat lodge showed up, and immediately um, one of the elders came over and said, something is not right here. Did you drink or smoke? And he said, no. And then we went through the process, and we were all sitting in the sweat lodge together. And the man who was leading it said, he's like, okay, somebody in here used alcohol, and I know exactly who you are, and you're making this harder for everyone. And you young people think that your actions exist in a vacuum and they don't affect other people. But what you did is affecting every single one of us here. And he went on to speak about that and how that is sort of like kind of a social illness too. And everything we do does have a ripple effect on kind of a spiritual level. When we hurt ourselves, when we hurt other people, we're hurting ourselves. When we hurt ourselves, like we're hurting other people, we really, um, yeah. And so I think this is just making all of that very explicit right now. And so it really is this opportunity. I think a lot of people are growing quite a bit from this, even though it's like we won't know until after it's over
Mm-hmm.
what that all looks like, and if that will lead to social change or or reform or anything. But I do think people are being forced to look outside and think about, their parents or other people that are close to them when they might not normally do that.
Yeah, I've been getting in touch and hearing from people in a way that I haven't in the past 20 years. People
Mhm.
checking on each other, and it's
Mhm.
nice. Everybody's, I think, inspired to think beyond themselves, and
Mhm.
it's really cool.
I just noticed I touched my face, speaking of, and I have been like this, but
I didn't notice that you touched your face. I
speaking
think
of
I touched my
self-awareness,
face a couple times too. It's really hard not to touch your face.
yeah, it is. But I do wash my hands a lot, so
Yeah,
there's,
I keep washing my
um,
hands.
and I'm not really leaving the.
What do you do when you have this burning itch, like on the side of your face, and you just have to sit with that, I guess, when you're
I mean,
aware?
I think you can itch your face if your hands are washed, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
not outside, but
yeah.
it's really the idea of like if you're walking around, you're outside, and you come in the house, it's like washing your hands before you do any of that.
Mhm,
Um, I think the main reason, and actually this is something where maybe I don't have as much knowledge, but I think it's because if you like sneeze or you have droplets on your hands,
mhm.
that's what's you don't want to get on your face.
If someone sneezes, like outside or in the store, it's like everybody freaks out.
Oh yeah.
You
I
better
mean,
get all your sneezes out before you go to the store.
totally. And
It
wear
doesn't matter if you sneeze in your elbow
and
or
a
into
mask.
your mask.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And a mask.
And
Mask
a mask.
and then even so, yeah, it doesn't. I mean, it's so transmittable. They really don't know. I
Right.
read the recent some recent article about 27 feet is the ideal distance actually.
Oh God.
So I mean, I'm doing my
Well,
best.
that's why it's important to keep staying informed, because everything that makes sense today might be a little bit behind tomorrow.
Yeah. And the more we can just really follow these guidelines, potentially the more information we can get before it spreads. And um, yeah, I started to listen to, I didn't finish it today. There's an interesting interview with Bill Gates. I don't know if you heard this, but I guess he had a TED talk that predicted a
I saw
pandemic.
the TED Talk, yeah, from like 4 years ago. That was
Yeah.
pretty scary.
Oh, I haven't seen, I would like to see it. Trevor Noah interviewed him just to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, the whole development of virus after virus in this century is extremely alarming.
Mhm.
And again, it's going to take cooperation, compassion, empathy on very large scales between countries, between world leaders. I think there's a vacuum of leadership on all levels, including globally.
Yeah.
And there's a lack of trust. Countries don't trust other countries. Propaganda in every country. Um, we're constantly told, and we don't even know if we can trust this data coming out of China. So,
Oh,
so
yeah. Doesn't sound.
and you have no idea sometimes what the motives are of all of this. So yeah, it's stressful. It's stressful for people. But what Bill Gates is talking about in that TED talk is just we're not prepared, and we can see that we weren't prepared. It's scary to think that he was saying we're not prepared for what's likely coming, and he
Yeah.
was saying that in advance. But
Yeah, I
people
think there was
warn.
another movie that came out that I didn't see that somebody recommended. Maybe it's called The Great Pandemic or something. That was a
Mm.
Netflix documentary, I think. But yeah, it's interesting too because they I don't released. I don't know how many masks. I'm forgetting. There's so many numbers flying around. Maybe it was 25,000 masks in California from a warehouse, and 95 masks that were supposed to be for this purpose, but they were all expired. And like, so the question there is like, well, why would you let them expire?
Yeah.
If they're there for this to be prepared for an emergency. Like, don't, why would the, yeah. So, I don't
Yeah.
know. I guess it would be good to keep it's good to keep the expired stockpile and add fresh ones on top of
I
that.
do. I was just thinking that too. At this point, we'll take the expired ones, or,
They did. They
better than
are,
nothing.
yeah, they're using the expired ones, and they're saying that the main reason that they might not be effective would just be because the elastic might be worn out, so they might not fit snugly, but they were stored in like temperature controlled
Yeah.
conditions. They're likely to still be working. I don't know how expired they are. I don't remember with
I
what.
feel bad though, Lauren, for all the people in, well, starting with healthcare in medical fields, like, you don't really sign up for this kind of thing. I mean, you do sign up to help people, but you don't sign up necessarily to be so
Right,
at risk
right,
and maybe not having the equipment you need. And then beyond that, I mean, like people working at stores, people working for a company like Amazon, that
yeah,
really it's just like we're calling them heroes, and they are heroes. It'll probably redefine patriotism after this, but I feel bad for people who really, like, they weren't looking to play this role. It's like if they don't go to work, what is their alternative? And I do know that there's a large percentage of people that are just doing it because they have very little choice in the matter, and it's just extremely
yeah.
scary and stressful for them.
Yeah, it's a huge, I mean, there's a class divide, right? That's
Right.
also happening here. And if you're living paycheck to paycheck, um, you can't afford to not work, right? And so
Right.
you're forced to choose between your health and well-being or having an income. And that's for people who are already working there. And then I think Instacart was striking, which is another company, right? Because they weren't getting health benefits, which I think is just, I don't know, I haven't followed what's happening with that, but that's just nuts, right? Like these
Hmm.
companies are making so much money right now. They're the only companies making any money, and they're making money off of labor of people who have no choice and who are putting their lives at risk,
Yeah.
not offering health benefits in return. And I think, I'm not sure, Uber, I'm not sure what I haven't followed up with what these companies are doing. I mean, for my part, like I'm wanting to find ways to organize and offer mental health services to people who are in these positions, because I don't, I don't know that I could make a big dent in a lot of what companies are doing, but it's something that's interesting to me, and then I'd like to learn more about and know how I can help more with, because um, yeah, there's a real like a divide between people who have the privilege to work from home and those who don't. And the ones who are privileged aren't necessarily, right, like doing what they doing their duty of staying home and staying off the streets and keeping people safe. And they might be going out and socializing. And that's putting at risk, not only the older generations, but also the people who are putting their lives at risk because they have to for their jobs. And so it's like I feel protective of people doing that kind of work too, because any carelessness affects them.
Yeah. And when you mention inequality, how sad is it, Lauren, just to think that we can't pause we can't pause the world for we couldn't even pause for 2 days. After 2 days, after industries were failing, I mean, but we should be able to pause every year. We should, the whole world should be harmonized enough that we know, we need to all take at least 2 weeks off a year.
Yeah,
But I mean, I'm saying, like, because of inequality, we can't pause because people will lose their livelihoods because they don't even have, like, half of our country doesn't have $400 saved up.
yeah.
So
I mean,
that's sad, and but that puts all of us at harm. That it's there's that much inequality.
yeah, it does, and it brings up something interesting too about the role of government, I think, and I haven't fully explored this, but if you think about how many social programs just all of a sudden got implemented, right? Like rents in San Francisco were being freezed, right? Heating would continue to work even if you don't pay your bills. Those things, like, why don't we have more proactive sort of options for that? Like, why is it?
Right.
Those are social, we have a lot of social constructs, I guess is what I'm trying to say about what's possible and what's not possible. That I'm really thankful this pandemic is tumbling, right? Like I'm really
Yes.
thankful that we can say, oh, you know what? We can freeze the rent. We can have humanity. We don't have to nickel and dime you when the world is ending and we're all at risk. Like we can we can adjust. Not, I don't think everyone is doing that, but I think there is a lot of that being offered and a lot of that
Mhm. It's
publicly.
interesting the timing when all these things were considered extremely radical ideas that we could help people in different ways. I mean, what is a government of the people if not a social contract to take care of each other,
Mhm.
at the very core?
Yeah, and we've so lost sight of that, and it's so clear that our government needs to really be reformed, and we haven't really implemented the intention of the Constitution, and so I think, there's a lot of things that need to be examined in all different aspects of government, and for me, it's like I want to believe that we can just start by opening our hearts and getting in touch with our humanity and asking, like, not let's not look at everything and try to problem solve backwards, but say, okay, like what do we, if we were to look at this from a different lens and a different perspective, how can we make change that just works better for everyone and creates
And
more.
hopefully we can see then, other people's happiness, the happiness of all
Yeah,
is includes you, but
yeah,
when people are all looking out for just their own well-being, then you're also creating future harm for yourself.
depending on how you do it. It's like, right, if your well-being is like, oh, I need to go to this party or this social event for my own well-being, even if I'm putting myself at risk, versus like, oh, for my own well-being, I'm going to follow what I know the collective needs and try to
Yeah.
meet my needs within that.
Yeah.
Like
My
there
friend,
has to
my
be.
friend Alex called it the Declaration of Interdependence.
Yeah, that's so sweet. I like that.
I like it too. It's sweet. If you thought of like civilizations in the past or societies in the past, like maybe a hunter-gatherer society thousands and thousands of years ago, if there's like a hurricane coming, and well, the obvious thing to do would be like, all right, let's shelter in place, right, until it passes. But imagine half of that society has to go, well, no, we can't, because we will die. We have to get food right now. So we're just going to go out and risk it. I mean, that's kind of where we're at as a civilization, as a human civilization, that we've structured ourselves, we've organized ourselves somehow in this way where people actually can't stop. The human race is a race, and then that puts us all at risk.
Hmm.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask you about is for single people in this time, what are you, what sort of things are coming up for you with clients that might be still hoping to find love? Is it a good time to pause and do introspection, or to still connect on apps? And maybe it's a time for that and just getting to know people before actually seeing them. And I know you help people like find deeper connection, but
Hmm.
what are your thoughts on that so far?
It definitely, well, it varies person to person, but I would say, so for some people, like if you're coming out of a relationship, it could be a really good time to just pause, reorient, reflect. And for others, it's a good time to meet, to reach out and connect and meet people. If you've been, you feel really like you are processing your emotions all along the way, and you're in a good place to be in a
Mm-hmm.
relationship, I still think it's a time to get to know people and date. Like there are, and I'm noticing like some of my more introverted clients are liking this format for dating of there's like online speed dating, and in addition to online speed dating, I guess there's the apps, but the apps are a little, they're getting a lot more action now, but they're just kind of tired in general. There's like a lot of lack of accountability and just chit chatting. So the apps are now, I think, kind of having a heyday where there's a lot of chit chatting. There's nothing else you can do. You can't really meet up with people. So there's a little more accountability. So I think online dating is a little bit more um, engaging than usual because people aren't so busy that they are just making it last priority.
Mm.
So it is
Yeah,
a good way
that's
to get to know
interesting.
people. Yeah, and then the online speed dating and things like that, and reaching out to people, having conversations. It's a good time to just, start to plant seeds of connection. And I would say the dating remotely brings up a lot of kind of opportunities for creativity, which is nice. Um, there's like, you can use Netflix party and have a Netflix date with someone remotely. There's
Yeah.
you can do a remote sleepover. I mean, there's really connection and intimacy that and slow down that process of just jumping into something or distracting yourself, but really getting to know someone. So I think it's a good time if you're coming from a genuine place of like being ready for a relationship. If you're wanting to just avoid the catastrophe, I would say it's a balance between trying to do what you need to do for yourself and also, staying open. So
Thank you. Well, it's been great chatting with you, Lauren. Thanks for making time to talk with me.
yeah, it's been great chatting with you too.
And anyone who's watching this or listening, you can check out Lauren's book, The Mindful Relationship. May be even more helpful for you during this time of quarantining with your partner, or as you look for tips and strategies for building deeper connection. So thank you again, and look forward to next time.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to say that I'm doing, during this time at least, I'm doing a free meditation class on Fridays at 5:30 called Meditate, which is
Oh,
um,
cool.
yeah. So
And where else can people find your work and more about you?
just on my website, laurenkorshakmft.com. I have an Instagram as well that I haven't been posting on during quarantine, but usually I do, Love Well SF. And yeah, and I
Uh-huh.
have on that website, there's a link to Meditate. It's a free class, and I've been doing it on Zoom, and now I'm doing it on Google Hangouts because of the Zoom privacy issues. So yeah, feel free to
Good.
tune in. And we're just cultivating a little bit of metta or kindness at the end of each class.
Okay, that sounds nice. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you.